A Wisconsin housewife stands at her kitchen counter in 1950, heart hammering. In front of her, a blob of white shortening that looks disturbingly like cold lard. She tears open a small packet of bright orange powder and begins to mix. She is technically committing a crime. Not jaywalking, not a parking ticket, a crime that could land her in front of a judge, reported by a neighbor, prosecuted by a state that had decided the color of your breakfast spread was a matter of law enforcement. Her offense? Making her food look appetizing. And she was not alone. Across America, millions of women were doing exactly the same thing, smuggling color into their kitchens, one illegal packet at a time. This was the result of a century-long campaign by the most powerful agricultural lobby in American history. A campaign so ruthless, so legally creative, and so staggeringly effective that it turned a kitchen staple into contraband. But to understand how it happened, you have to go back to a hungry army and a desperate French emperor. It is 1869. Napoleon III is watching his empire crack. His army is underfed, his urban poor are starving, and butter, real, golden, farm-fresh butter, costs more than most French workers earn in a day. He needs a miracle. So he does what emperors do. He offers money. The prize, a cash reward for anyone who could produce a cheap, stable butter substitute that could feed soldiers and the poor without spoiling on the march. The empire is offering a bounty on a product that doesn't yet exist. Enter Hippolyte Mejmouriès, a French chemist with very unconventional ideas about dairy. Mejmouriès had a theory. He believed that when a cow was under nutritional stress, it drew on its own body fat to produce milk. Therefore, he reasoned, if you could replicate that process artificially, forcing beef tallow through the biological machinery of a cow, you might get something close to butter. The method was exactly as strange as it sounds. He took rendered beef fat, oleomargarine, from the Greek word for pearl-like luster, kneaded it with real cow udder tissue, mixed in milk, and chilled it. What came out was a pale, spreadable fat that could pass for butter in a dim light. He won the prize. He patented the process in 1869, and he had absolutely no idea what he had just unleashed. Within a decade, industrial manufacturers in Europe and America had streamlined the process, replacing cow udders with industrial churns and beef tallow with cheaper vegetable oils. Margarine was efficient, it was shelf-stable, it was cheap, and it was spreading in every sense of the word. The dairy industry noticed, and the dairy industry was not amused. The butter lobby's response would become one of the most audacious legislative campaigns in American food history, and it would eventually make it a criminal offense to own the wrong color of cooking fat. The National Butter, Cheese, and Egg Association, and yes, that was a real organization with real political muscle, descended on Washington with a simple argument. Margarine was fraud. It looked like butter, it was sold like butter. But it wasn't butter, and someone, they insisted, had to pay. In 1886, Congress passed the Oleomargarine Act, a federal tax on margarine production and a licensing requirement for every dealer who sold it. It was punishing, but it wasn't enough for the dairy states. Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York, states where dairy was king, wanted margarine not just taxed, they wanted it made unrecognizable. The strategy was elegant in its cruelty. Everyone knew margarine's main appeal was that it looked like butter. Take away the color, the lobby reasoned, and you take away the product. And so state by state, a new kind of law appeared on the books. You could sell margarine, but only if it was white. The color yellow, it turned out, was the target. By the early 1900s, 32 American states had passed anti-coloring laws. Some went further. It was illegal to possess yellow food coloring with intent to color margarine. Some states banned any shade remotely butter-adjacent. New Hampshire briefly required margarine to be dyed pink, apparently to make absolutely certain no one would confuse it for something desirable. Pink margarine. Let that sink in. The legislative goal was not safety, not transparency, not even honest labeling. The goal was to make the product look so revolting that no household in America would voluntarily put it on the table. The dairy lobby had essentially weaponized disgust. Rehook. But the dairy lobby had badly miscalculated one thing: the price of butter during wartime and the fury of American housewives who couldn't afford it. World War II changed everything. Butter was rationed, dairy herds were requisitioned. The fat that Americans had spread on their morning toast for generations was suddenly, officially, a luxury. Margarine sales exploded, even the white, lard-like, deeply unappealing legal version, and the coloring packets that manufacturers included with every purchase became a kitchen ritual. The packets were a legal workaround, genius in its simplicity. The manufacturer sold you white margarine, which was legal, and also sold you a separate packet of yellow dye, which was also technically legal. What you did with them in your own kitchen was your business, until in several states, it very much became the government's business. Wisconsin was the last and most ferocious battlefield. The dairy state had banned yellow margarine not just in stores, but in restaurants, in institutions, and eventually in private homes. To buy the coloring packets in Wisconsin was to invite arrest. Inspectors visited restaurants. Housewives were prosecuted. The law was not symbolic. It had teeth. The absurdity peaked in documented cases of Wisconsin residents driving to Illinois. The state line was less than an hour from Milwaukee, specifically to buy yellow margarine and smuggle it home. There were margarine runs, like bootleggers, but for breakfast spreads. The parallels to Prohibition were not lost on anyone paying attention. Rehook, a substance that had started as a solution to military starvation, had somehow become the center of one of the strangest regulatory battles in American domestic history, and the women fighting it were about to win. The turning point came not from the courts, but from the grocery store. By 1950, margarine outsold butter in America for the first time in history. The economics were undeniable. The legal architecture was crumbling under its own absurdity, and the political calculus had shifted. The housewife vote mattered more than the dairy lobby's donations. In 1950, Congress repealed the Federal Oleomargarine Act, eliminating the punishing tax structure and, crucially, removing federal support for the color ban. States began to fall. New York in 1952, Minnesota devastatingly for the dairy lobby in 1963. Wisconsin held out until 1967, the last state to finally grudgingly allow its citizens to purchase yellow margarine without legal consequence. The century-long war over the color of a breakfast spread ended not with a verdict, not with a moral reckoning, but with a whimper of legislative exhaustion. The dairy lobby had spent 100 years and enormous political capital to make one product look unappetizing, and in the end, American housewives had simply mixed the color in themselves. The woman at her kitchen counter in 1950, mixing her illegal orange packet into white shortening, was not a radical. She was not a protester. She was a person who wanted her toast to look like breakfast. And in doing so, she was participating in one of the most unsung acts of mass civil disobedience in American history. Millions of women across decades, quietly mixing color back into a world that powerful men had decided should stay pale. 1869. The French Empire is bleeding out. Prussian armies are massing on the border. Revolution is whispering in the streets, and Napoleon III has a problem that no general can solve. His soldiers are starving, and butter costs a fortune. Butter in 1869 was not a luxury. It was a necessity. But it was expensive, inconsistent, and in the summer heat of a military campaign, it turned rancid within days. The poor of Paris could not afford it. The army could not rely on it. Something had to change. Napoleon III did what emperors do when facing problems they cannot shoot. He offered a cash prize, an open competition for any chemist, any inventor, any lateral thinker who could conjure a cheap, stable substitute for butter. The prize was real. The need was desperate, and one man decided to answer. Hippolyte Mejmouriès was a French chemist who had spent his career solving unglamorous problems for the French government: food preservation, bread improvement, the chemistry of the ordinary. He was not famous, he was not fashionable, but he was relentlessly curious, and he had absolutely no squeamishness about how food actually worked. His solution began with beef tallow, rendered cattle fat, the same base used in candles and soap. Mejmouriès observed that cows under nutritional stress continued producing milk by metabolizing their own body fat. He believed the secret to butter's texture lay in how fatty acids moved through living tissue, so he decided to replicate that process outside the animal. What happened next has been described in period accounts with varying degrees of specificity and varying degrees of horror. The tallow was processed in part through actual bovine mammary gland tissue, not to extract milk, but to encourage emulsification, to let the fat pass through biological structures that nature had designed to handle exactly this kind of transformation. It was, in the most literal sense, a shortcut through a cow. The result was pale, it was greasy. It had a faint, vaguely familiar richness that was not quite butter and not quite anything else. Margarine named it oleomargarine, from the Greek margarites, meaning pearl, because of the faint pearlescent shimmer the processed fat produced. It was not, by most accounts, delicious, but it was cheap, and it was stable, and it did not spoil in a soldier's pack on a summer march. Margarine won the prize. He patented his creation in 1869 and began the work of commercializing it. Within a few years, he sold the international rights to a Dutch trading company called Jurgens, a firm that would merge, consolidate, and grow over the following decades into one of the largest consumer goods corporations in human history. You may know it today as Unilever. And here is where the story stops being about chemistry and starts being about war. Because somewhere in the butter-producing regions of France, of the Netherlands, of Wisconsin, dairy farmers and butter merchants were reading the same newspapers. They were watching oleomargarine enter the market, and they felt something cold move through them. Not dread exactly, recognition. The recognition that they were looking at the thing that might destroy them. Butter had been one of the most politically protected foods in the Western world for centuries, taxed, regulated, traded, and fiercely defended by agricultural interests with deep roots in rural economies and deep pockets in national legislatures. Margarine had been alive for less than a decade, and it was already undercutting butter on price by a significant margin. The dairy lobby did not deliberate long. They picked up their weapons, and their weapons, it turned out, were laws. But before the laws came the propaganda, and the propaganda was spectacular. Margarine, the dairy industry would claim, was made from diseased cattle, from slaughterhouse waste, from substances so vile they could not be named in polite company. None of it was rigorously true. All of it was devastatingly effective. The war for the American breakfast table and for the American statute book was about to begin. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Within 15 years of oleomargarine's invention, 32 American states would pass laws making it a criminal offense to sell yellow margarine. Not to make it, not to eat it, to sell it the color of butter. The color itself became contraband. That is not a footnote. That is the story. By the 1880s, margarine had crossed the Atlantic and found its people. Not the wealthy, not the well-fed, but the millions of working-class Americans for whom real butter was simply out of reach. It spread on bread, it fried eggs, it worked, and it was selling. There was one problem. Fresh from the factory, margarine was the color of a February sky, gray, pallid, deeply unappetizing. Manufacturers knew this, so they did what any rational businessman would do. They added yellow dye. Sales climbed almost immediately. In Wisconsin, in Minnesota, in the dairy corridors of upstate New York, farmers watched their butter sales erode and reached a collective conclusion. This was war, not a price war, not a quality war, a political war, and they intended to win it completely. Dairy lobbyists descended on state legislatures with money, with influence, and with a carefully constructed argument. Margarine, they said, was fraud. It was deception poured into a tub and sold to innocent consumers who thought they were buying the real thing. It had to be stopped. But here is what the dairy industry did not do. They did not ask governments to ban margarine. They did not demand it be pulled from shelves. They asked, specifically surgically, that the yellow coloring be made illegal. Nothing else. Just the color. That single detail exposes everything. If this were truly about consumer fraud, you ban the fraudulent product. You don't ban its color while letting it sit on every shelf in America. The target was never deception. The target was desire. Make it ugly. Kill the appetite. Starve the competition. The laws came fast. State after state passed restrictions on colored margarine, and some went further. New Hampshire required margarine be dyed fluorescent yellow, a shade so garish it read as a warning label. Other states mandated an unsettling pink. The message was not subtle. Then came Washington. The Federal Margarine Act of 1886 imposed a tax structure designed not to regulate margarine, but to financially suffocate it. Colored margarine was taxed at rates that made it commercially suicidal to produce. The dairy lobby had successfully nationalized its war. By 1902, sources indicate that 32 American states had laws on the books against yellow margarine. 32 states had looked at a color, a shade of yellow, and declared it a criminal act. The most successful consumer product in a generation had been legislated into looking like something dug from the back of a refrigerator. And yet Americans still bought it. White, gray, unappetizing as cold lard, they still bought it. Because poverty doesn't care about color. When you cannot afford butter, you eat what you can't afford. The dairy industry had won every legal battle, but margarine refused to die, which meant the war had to go somewhere new. If the law could not kill the product, it would have to humiliate the people who bought it, and eventually it would send housewives to their kitchen tables to commit a crime that, in any other context, would sound completely insane, illegally coloring their own food. The dairy lobby had won the legislature, but they had forgotten about the kitchen. Blocked from selling a yellow product, margarine manufacturers did something quietly brilliant. They put the color inside the package, a small capsule, a little bead of golden dye, tucked right alongside the white block. The instructions were simple: knead until yellow. Across America, before breakfast, before Sunday dinner, before company arrived, women stood at their kitchen tables and worked color into fat with their bare hands. It became ritual, it became routine. It became, in some states, a crime. The laws on the books were not abstract. They targeted the act of coloring, the possession of yellow margarine, the sale of it, and in the strictest jurisdictions, the domestic production of it. Prosecutors had the authority. Some used it. Court records are scattered. The full picture is murky, but documented cases exist. Women questioned, women warned, women prosecuted for doing nothing more than trying to make their family's dinner look appetizing. They were kitchen criminals, guilty of color. And then there was Wisconsin. Wisconsin called itself the dairy state. It meant it. While other states slowly surrendered their yellow margarine bans through the 1950s, Wisconsin held the line, then held it longer, then kept holding it while the world changed around them. In 1957, Sputnik broke the sound barrier of space. The Soviet Union had put metal into orbit around the Earth. Wisconsin had not yet permitted yellow margarine. John Glenn circled the planet in 1962. Wisconsin dairy lobbyists circled the State House. The ban held. In Wisconsin restaurants, the arrangement had teeth. Establishments were reportedly required to serve butter by default. Margarine could only appear on request, explicit, verbal, deliberate request, and even then it had to be clearly identified. The swap made quietly could trigger a fine. Think about what that means: a diner, a customer, a pat of the wrong fat, and the government steps in. The dairy lobby had not merely influenced policy, it had colonized daily life. This is the part the lobby never wanted said out loud. It was never about health. There was no science protecting Wisconsin consumers from yellow fat. There was money, there were votes, there were dairy farmers who wrote checks and senators who cashed them. The ban had been dressed in the language of consumer protection: prevent fraud, prevent deception, keep the public from mistaking margarine for butter. But the public knew exactly what it was buying. It was the legislators who were confused about their loyalties. 1967. The Beatles had released Saint Pepper. The summer of love was weeks away. And in Madison, Wisconsin, a state legislator finally cast the vote that ended the last yellow margarine ban in the United States of America. 97 years after Napoleon's chemist squeezed beef tallow through a cow udder and called it the future, America was finally allowed to eat yellow margarine in every single state. The kitchen criminals had won. It just took a century. By 1942, butter had become a weapon of war, rationed, hoarded, and precious. The same product the dairy industry had spent 50 years protecting was now too valuable to eat. And into that vacuum stepped the enemy: margarine. The white, waxy, government-tolerated imposter that millions of American families had been legally forbidden from dyeing yellow was now on every kitchen counter in the country. Housewives who had never touched margarine in their lives were now kneading dye capsules into white blocks with their bare hands and calling it patriotism. The ritual that Wisconsin had tried to criminalize, the home dyeing of margarine, was now a domestic act of wartime sacrifice. The law hadn't changed, the country had. And here is the rehook that changes everything. The dairy industry had fought for half a century to keep margarine off American tables. World War II put it there in 4 years flat. A generation of children grew up eating margarine without shame, without stigma, without ever knowing there had been a war fought over the color of their breakfast spread. When the war ended and the soldiers came home, they brought with them an appetite shaped by absence. Butter was fine, but margarine was familiar. The psychological barrier had been demolished. State by state, the yellow margarine laws collapsed like dominoes. The color bans, defended for decades as matters of public integrity, quietly disappeared from the books. In 1950, Congress drove a stake through the heart of the dairy lobby's greatest weapon, the federal oleomargarine tax. The punishing tariff designed to strangle margarine in its cradle was repealed. Wisconsin held out until 1967, the last state in the Union to legalize yellow margarine, the final fortress of butter nationalism, surrendering 80 years after the war began. But the story was not over, because history had one more act of savage irony waiting in the wings, and it would arrive wearing a lab coat. To make margarine solid at room temperature, manufacturers had relied on a process called hydrogenation, pumping hydrogen gas through liquid vegetable oil. It worked. It also created something chemists called trans fats. For decades, nobody looked too hard at what trans fats actually did inside the human body. Margarine was cheaper than butter. It was modern. It was scientific. That was enough. Then the research came. Study after study through the 1990s and into the 2000s, building toward a verdict that the dairy industry had never intended to be right about, and for reasons they could never have imagined. Trans fats, the science concluded, raised bad cholesterol, lowered good cholesterol, and contributed to heart disease at rates that alarmed cardiologists worldwide. Margarine, in its hydrogenated form, was not the butter substitute that saved lives. It may have shortened them. The dairy industry had spent a century calling margarine dangerous. They were wrong about why. They were wrong about the mechanism. But in the specific formulations that had dominated the market for decades, they were not entirely wrong about the outcome. Consider the geometry of this catastrophe. Butter lobbyists had bribed legislators, arrested housewives, and taxed a product into near oblivion, based on the claim that it was a health threat. And the product had responded by actually becoming one. Margarine manufacturers scrambled to reformulate. Trans fat-free versions flooded the market. The word hydrogenated became toxic in grocery store aisles. The industry reinvented itself, again. And butter, the ancient, aristocratic, saturated fat-laden original, quietly staged its comeback, not because the science fully vindicated it, but because the alternative had burned down. This is where the margarine conspiracy ends, not with a villain triumphant or a hero vindicated, but with everyone implicated. The lobbyists who lied, the scientists who missed the data, the governments that sold their votes, and the consumers left to knead dye into white blocks in their kitchens, trusting that someone, somewhere, was telling them the truth. Today, margarine sits quietly in the dairy aisle. No warning labels, no special taxes, no state troopers waiting to arrest you for the color of your spread. It is, by every measure, unremarkable. The war is over, and most people never knew there was one. The margarine sold in America today is trans fat-free, carefully formulated, and nearly indistinguishable from butter in both color and texture. The industry that was once forced to sell its product looking like congealed lard now competes on equal visual terms. It took the better part of a century to get there. Wisconsin, the last American state to lift the yellow margarine ban, finally relented in 1967. The dairy lobby had held the line for decades, but consumer demand had simply become too loud to legislate against. The housewives had won. It just took a generation. But here is what the end of the margarine wars actually left behind. Not a victory for free markets or consumer rights, but a blueprint, a detailed, tested, legally validated blueprint for how an entrenched industry can weaponize government regulation against a cheaper competitor without ever admitting that is what it is doing. You do not ban the product, you regulate its appearance, you make it ugly, you make it suspicious, you make it look like something a rational person would not want to eat. And then you stand back and let human psychology do the rest of the work for you. The tobacco industry studied it, so did pharmaceutical companies, agricultural conglomerates, and the sugar lobby. Control the aesthetic, control the narrative, control the market. The margarine precedent proved that a product's legality and a product's appearance are two entirely separate levers, and that governments will pull the second one if you pay them enough. The story that began with Napoleon III offering a cash prize for cheap beef fat ends here. In every food dye regulation, every packaging law, every agricultural appearance standard that serves a producer rather than a consumer, the mechanism is identical. Only the product has changed. And consider what was actually being regulated during those 80 years of margarine law. Not safety, not nutrition, not honest labeling. The government was not protecting anyone from a harmful product. It was protecting a profitable one from a cheaper one. The regulatory apparatus of the state, at the lobbying industry's request, became a tool for preserving market share. This is the rehook the story earns. The most dangerous thing about the margarine wars is not that it happened, it is that it worked. For 80 years, it worked perfectly, and the people who made it work went home and slept without difficulty. Think about the women at those kitchen tables. They were not radicals. They were not food activists or political agitators. They were people who wanted their toast to look like breakfast. And for that, in 32 American states, they were criminals. They were breaking laws written not to protect them, but to inconvenience them into buying something else. History remembers the chemists and the lobbyists and the legislators. It forgets the women at the bowls. But they are the moral center of this entire story. Every time the system manufactured an obstacle, they found a workaround. Every time the law made something ugly, they made it beautiful again at their own kitchen tables, at their own risk. The margarine is yellow now. The law is gone. But the structure that built those laws has never left. It adapted, diversified, and professionalized. What the butter lobby built in the 1870s is now an entire industry, one with lobbyists and legal teams and regulatory affairs divisions dedicated full-time to the proposition that your food should look exactly the way someone else has paid for it to look. The margarine wars ended. The logic of the margarine wars did not. The next time a government tells you a product must be a certain color, or cannot be a certain color, or must be packaged in a way that makes it look worse than its competitor, ask who paid for that regulation. Ask who it serves. The answer will not be you. The story of margarine is not really about fat. It is not about butter. It is barely about food. It is about the precise moment when a government decided that appearance was worth policing, that aesthetics were worth criminalizing, and that the highest bidder had the right to define what ordinary people's breakfast was allowed to look like. They just wanted their toast to look like breakfast. For 80 years, someone powerful enough to write laws decided they could not have that. The butter is still winning somewhere. It always is. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out other videos.